Hello, welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. In this series of episodes, I am talking about media and journalism. Not the same thing. You heard. In the previous parts, I talked a little bit about epistemology and our formation of belief and knowledge. And I talked in the second bit a little bit about media, kind of in general, and how the media information sphere sort of evolved into the current circusy mess that we have now, which is like not a bad thing necessarily, right? It has bad things going on in it, but like, I think the circusy bit is really just who we are. And like, that's cool. Right? Let's just be open to that, right? Like, let's just be open to that it's cool. It's what we are. It's just be honest. It's fine. And in the following part, I'm going to talk a lot about journalism. I love it. I admire people who are in it, and I respect them a great deal. I think it's a dangerous gig in a lot of cases, and I think it also is hard work, and not like hard work, but it's hard work in the sense that it's demanding on kind of a multiple levels, right? Like, it's intellectually demanding, it's physically demanding, it can be emotionally demanding if you're researching or reporting on something that is sort of threatening people's images or welfare, and depending on how powerful those people are, right? Like, they may be leveraging or against you as an individual, trying to hold them accountable. Like, that's a likely outcome. So that's hard and a kind of unsafe feeling. So just a like big old hat tip to journalists. I think you really are noble and important, and I think that what you do is so critical to American culture. And I really want to talk about that. So for those of you who aren't journalists, I hope you feel the same. Like, let's all take a moment and appreciate journalists. Yay! Okay, so I'm going to talk about it and really through the lens of the specific journalism, like as it resides within the framework of media. There is an evolution there. I obviously talked about that quite a bit in the previous part, and in particular in the hands of William Randolph Hearst, who was a fascinating character. And so now I'm going to kind of speak a little more broadly. I hope you'll bear with me. Yay! One of the really hard things about living in the current age is the difficulty in having to confirm and verify every piece of information that's set before you. Information is available to American citizens and, again, global citizens in ways both illuminating and overwhelming. And the presentation of much of this information has a kind of agenda included with it. I observe people don't trust information if they don't trust the source. And that seems to make sense until you look at how trust is founded now when compared to how it was founded in previous periods in history. I think we all can agree there's been degradation in the trust in institutions over the last 50 years. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. But in partnership with that, the separation of ideologies then presented as journalistic fact, there is a tension there that it can be addressed in a more or less objective way, right? Like, if you have two data points that conflict, then you can generally find a kind of multitude of other data points to corroborate like one or another, right? And that doesn't associate value with it. But even that, right? Like, you have to kind of like be identifying the sourcing of each one of those data points and, kind of weighing it for credibility. It's become a very, it's become a difficult thing to have an opinion because you don't even know sometimes if without having done like rigorous research, if things that you're saying are even really true. you kind of, take some things at face value because they resonate for you. And it's a common practice. It's not like you're doing anything wrong. We're all doing it. But there is also a sense of like, mindfulness and self-awareness that, needs to be undertaken. And that's exhausting, really. Let's be honest. It's exhausting. That's why people, I think, don't want to always have to do that every day of their lives. Like, it's so tiresome to constantly having to be like, I hear you, but let me just check your facts first. Like, Jiminy Cricket. It's just it's a difficult way to live. Journalism is a central part of democratic functions. I feel like that's an a priori, right? Like, I think it goes without saying, though I'm saying it again, that journalism is a central part of democratic functions. But most of the time, it's giving you stuff you need, but you don't like that much. Like vegetables versus cake, So meaningful journalistic pursuits are usually kind of carried by more lucrative exploits like entertainment or gossip, right? In order to get your news. If you're going to buy the paper or like, click the link, you kind of want it to be something that's going to be more like cake. And if you get to choose, of course you're going to choose cake. An interesting side note here is that national news broadcasts were federally subsidized until like around the mid 1980s. And during that time, there wasn't a lot of hand-wringing about liberal media bias. That was just like a fun invention of right-wing activists and corporate media heads like Rupert Murdoch. And yeah, it's like kind of a myth, and it's been proven to be a myth, and yet it survives in our culture in like really obsessive ways. Like there's been that myth has become legend, which has become sort of like indisputable fact within, right-wing media spheres, which is how they justify their existence. But yeah, I mean, that's more of I think it's like a business question in some ways. So investigative journalism in particular, I think, has had an enormous role in both shaping public policy through the action of an informed electorate and challenging establishment powers who find themselves at odds with democratic principles. And that's huge, right? Both of those things are actually huge. The first empowers the voters to hold their elected officials accountable or to express desire relative to policy that's being implemented or not, as the case may be. And challenging establishment powers who, will abuse that power at some point. It's inevitable. We see it time and time again. Tammany Hall, at the point that the Hearst empire was just emerging, was the political machine that drove New York. And they very publicly and very actively stole elections constantly and were never held accountable for it. It took a long time of like reshaping public opinion through investigative journalistic endeavors to bring these things to light and help people to see what the action that was taking that was sort of undermining their votes. And, particularly for a community of immigrants who, are coming from dictatorial regimes, like the vote is everything. It's their entire existence. It's our entire existence as citizens, right? Like it's really, what we have. Our vote is like the like one thing, like life, that they can't like take from you. So it's journalism that has allowed those democratic principles to continue forth. And I do have a few examples. And it's a little bit of a timeline. I mean, it's not like, I'm not going to give you dates. How about that? I'm going to give you like rough times. Like, okay. So, Joseph Pulitzer owned the World, as previously mentioned. It was like the largest paper. They had a beautiful building in New York City with like a big gold dome. You could see it, as you were approaching from Ellis Island. Like he chose the location very specifically so that immigrants who are arriving into the city would see this like, tower of, noble American values. I just love that. I love that about him. Another thing I love about him is he was one of the first publishers to hire a woman for a journalistic endeavor, and her name was Nellie Bly. And Nellie Bly was a really just smart, curious, and tenacious reporter. And she was noticing some weird stuff about women, like middle-class women who just would like disappear into the sanatorium off in this island. I think it was called Black's Island off of New York. And so she had herself committed, and like it didn't take much to commit herself. Like she just was like a little ranty one day, and they were like, ooh, we're taking you to the sanatorium. And she goes in there and finds that like most of the women that are in there were in there for things like they didn't speak English, or they couldn't stop crying when their baby died. And so they were taken away from polite society and shut away, and they were tortured and abused. And these are private institutions at the time. Like there wasn't really like state infrastructure behind mental health services. So Nellie Bly was like the reporter that laid bare, like she exposed what was going on in the hospitals. And because this one was not like, singular in its treatment of patients and women in particular. And so that was a huge moment that led to significant state reform in mental health, and an example of how investigative journalism really helped to shape public policy. Another great example that I love is 1971 and the publishing of the Pentagon Papers, which was a really interesting moment in our history, again, having to do with war and opposition to war, and in particular the Vietnam War. And a gentleman by the name of Daniel Ellsberg, who was a CIA representative, he was an intelligence analyst, worked with the CIA, he worked with the Rand Corporation, and was one of the most brilliant, like, tactical military minds of his generation, and helped to shape some of the early military strategies in Vietnam. And then he saw this report that had been commissioned by then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. And that report, in essence, said that we knew that it was not a winnable war. There wasn't really a purpose to it. Every president, like Eisenhower, kind of started this kind of anti-communist agenda, and he had his eyeballs on Southeast Asia because of China, and China having moved into a communist regime. And so he basically funded the French going into Vietnam to try to take back their colony. That sort of started the ball rolling. And then there was some anti-communist attention paid to Southeast Asia, as a whole, specifically in Vietnam, because the French had their butts kicked and they left. And then Kennedy comes in and he's like, oh gosh, we can't lose a war. I can't be the first American president to lose a war. And so he escalates it. And then Johnson comes in and escalates it further. And then Nixon comes in and escalates it further. And each one of them knowing that there was no way to win that war, and that they didn't want us there. No one wanted us there. The South Vietnamese didn't want us there. The North Vietnamese definitely didn't want us there. Nobody wanted us there. And we didn't even want to be there, except for the fact that we were there. And we couldn't just be like, oh, well, and leave, apparently. Well, I mean, we totally could have. But apparently it would have looked bad. And so hundreds of thousands of American lives, not to mention the, probably millions of Vietnamese civilians who were murdered in this conflict over the period of like 35 years or something crazy like that, all laid bare in the Pentagon Papers, because Daniel decided that this was some bullshit and he couldn't do it anymore. And he leaked those papers to the press. And the New York Times began to publish it. Then the DOJ came after them and filed an injunction and said, don't do it or else we're going to shut you down. The Post then picked it up. They started to publish it. DOJ came out and said, nah, man. And they shut them down too. Another injunction. And then the next thing you know, papers all over the United States started publishing little bits of it here, little bits of it there. And the floodgate opened. Then there was a Supreme Court case that legitimized that publications could publish sensitive government documents, even if they were leaked. And so that was a big like barrier that was just, allowed to go up in terms of a check on government activity. They lied to the American people time and time and time and time again. And it was journalism, ultimately, that allowed the American people to know this. And it's what culminated in, a lot of the crazy activity that has lent itself to a continuing degradation of American trust in public institutions because they've lied. Here's another example. Watergate. I mean, I don't need to talk much about Watergate, right? You know what happened. And if you don't, there's a billion movies about it. But suffice to say, the committee to re-elect the president at the time, Richard Nixon, broke into the Democratic National Convention headquarters and like planted bugs and stuff. And it was bad news, man. And the president knew, and he was in on the planning, and he lied about it. And P.S. all this was going on while his vice president was about to be impeached for massive bribery and corruption scandal. So, tough times in America. And journalism is the thing that illuminated us to much of this activity and allowed for the political will of Republicans at that time to go to the president and say, Dick, you gotta go, man. Like, you can't keep this charade up anymore. The jig is up. And then he had the decency to resign. So, obviously the dogged reporting of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward were central in Watergate, and the editorial convictions of Ben Bradley at the Post, as well as the owner, Katharine Graham. Like, these were people who really knew what they were up against in, significant establishment power, and they just went ahead and did it anyway because they felt it was the right thing to do, for the American people. That's pretty freaking noble, if you ask me. Iran-Contra is another good example where journalistic reporting revealed some pretty shady stuff going on at the top levels of government, though there just wasn't a lot of accountability on this one. But there were some pretty sexy hearings about it. That's another one to Google if you want to know what happened. But like the big headline is essentially that the United States government funded the Sandinistas, which were freedom fighters in El Salvador, through arms money that they acquired from selling arms and armaments to Iran. Bad news. We're not supposed to do any of those things. A more recent example, or a couple of more recent examples, one of which I've spoken about before, is the Panama Papers. Just a huge investigative journalistic triumph across a massive coalition of international journalists who have found the shelter corporations and the tax shelters and the money laundering conduits that, most of the richest people in the world have been taking advantage of in order to avoid paying taxes and steal people's money and hold it in offshore accounts so that they can never be touched, like Vladimir Putin. That's a really important understanding of how certain political dynamics are functioning, particularly with respect to the Russian oligarchy. Hungary and Viktor Orban is related to a lot of this. So there's some, as well as there were some British politicians who were caught up in this, as well as American politicians and corporate entities that were caught up in the Panama Papers as well. And I think it's pretty illuminating. Those things are very much not within the American zeitgeist in terms of how citizens of America should be contributing to the economic well-being of their countries. We're not an aristocracy, and yet, here we are sort of co-signing on this policy that allows for, complete impunity for the wealthiest citizens of the world. And that's shady and messed up. And then finally, the last, I think, really good example of an investigative journalistic triumph is that has really shaped the world that we live in is Harvey Weinstein. The horrible, misogynistic and abusive practices that he routinely committed on women, God knows how many. And Bill Cosby is another one too, where, oh my gosh, tectonic shifts in how women are treated in terms of being listened to and believed when they report incidences of abuse or assault It's a completely different universe now. And thank God that women are actually being listened to at this point. I mean, it's still, we're not where we need to be. There's still a lot of like, why was she there? Why was she dressed that way type thinking, right? Like there's still a lot of questions that shouldn't be asked. But you know, they're listened to. They at least have a voice, and there are people willing to advocate for them these days, where that's kind of new. Which is sad, man. That's sad. But that's where we are. So if journalism has such an important and powerful role in our culture and our governance, why don't we trust it? Why don't we as individuals want to elevate it and support it? If we vote with our dollars, why do we continue to buy cake and then complain about how unhealthy we are? You know, I think it's possible that the last 30 years of American history has actually transpired in a kind of choose your own adventure book. News, as we understand it now, is noise. Some of it is noise that resonates, and then we will focus in on that thing. Our brains weren't built to monitor so many frequencies all at once, so we are selective in our attention. And that process of selection is not necessarily an active one. It can, and often is, be a passive one that's happening at an intuitive and an automatic level. And those automations are formulated and programmed by experiences and by, sensory input over a period of time, shaping our epistemology, shaping the way that we're choosing information, because typically we're choosing information that affirms something that already feels right within us. But those things, they're being treated like a priori concepts, but are they? No, they're not. They're manufactured truths that are constructed via, a whole spectrum of data points, but they're individual to that. They're, they're very much customized to one specific person. In other words, what you're left with is a bunch of constructed and curated realities. But I think most people are smarter than most people give them credit for, even if just statistically, right? Like there's more smarties than dummies. Otherwise, we wouldn't still exist. And as I said before, people have proven time and again that contradictions do not trouble us. If they conflict with our feeling of safety and security, we can effortlessly dismiss them as meaningless flotsam, not relevant to the important ideal that sits at the center of your insecurity. It's a very tailored reality if we are only focused in on ourselves, which is easy to do in a world where we're isolated, in a world where, we're connected, but only in a virtual space, or more often in a virtual space, or we're only honest in a virtual space, or, those connections exist at like infinite points in space. And again, we can't just like be an open antenna absorbing all that input. We have to narrow it down to something that's digestible, that's consumable, that's comprehensible for our brains that are still in process, I think. I mean, who knows what we'll be able to do in like another millennia? It's a curious question. We're such raw material at this point, I think, so early in our development. I wonder, right, if this is the peak of it, or if there's something much, much more to come, and if we'll even make it. Who knows? Maybe we will. That would be fun. Anyway, that's what I have to say about media and journalism today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you, just some food for thought about your media habits and the kind of stories that you digest and why, and what you want to know, what you train in on, the specific narratives that speak to you and why you think that might be. I think those are valuable exercises to pursue. I do them often, but only because I'm a busy thinker and an anxious person. I don't advise that. But, if you've got some free time in your life and you're interested in a fun thought experiment, thinking about the news that you digest and why and how you process it, I think is a fun exercise to do. And particularly within the framework of how other people are digesting that same thing? How do you think other people are reacting to it? Maybe ask them. It's fun to have conversations like that too. I mean, not in a combative way, as I've said before. Don't go pick a fight. I don't recommend it. It's not that fun. I mean, there are some people that really, really get off on like that kind of like verbal conflict. I don't, and I don't think a lot of people do. If you're angry like that, you're kind of better off going and like, hit a heavy bag for a while and then come back and let's talk, right? Like get that juice out of your system. And then, we can have a rousing dialogue about why you think I'm nuts. It's fun. All right. Thank you for joining me. Really, very sincerely, thank you for joining this series of episodes. I really do hope that you enjoyed it, because I think this is a huge topic and something that is so close to us that we really need to kind of give it the care and feeding that it deserves, that we deserve. We deserve to be able to feel like we're being told truths and to have legitimate information and to want to listen to our better angels. This is a good way of doing that. And, I have a podcast and I don't know why. I just want you to know that every download is a gift to me. It's like a great, wonderful, fun surprise to know that people are out there and actually listening. I really love it. And I hope that, I have something to say that you care about and that might, intrigue you a little bit or cause you to ask some questions, because this is the whole reason that we're here, as far as I'm concerned, is just to, dive in and live it and experience it and ask questions about it and be it. And so I am happy to be it with you. Happy holidays, happy new year to everyone listening in 2022. And we'll see you on the flip side in 2023. I think I'm going to keep doing this. I mean, nobody said stop, so I guess I may as well keep going. Thanks a lot. Until next time.